Welcome back to the Sanctuary Sessions with your man Twitch for Life. Today we got something a little bit different for y'all. Just the other day I was approached about producing another podcast. The podcast is called Reality Check. After being approached, we talked about some things, and I wanted to kind of give you guys some insight onto what the podcast conversations look like behind the scenes. And in the midst of doing all that, there was some other nuggets that dropped that Art was like, hey man, we really should put this out, because other people may need this information. So hopefully you guys can watch this and benefit from the information, and jump in the comments, tell us what you think about it. Tell us your ideas and how you get past some of these difficulties and or obstacles. All right, deuces. All right, so I'm going to give you speaking notes. I was trying to find something for both of y'all, but I mean, things will progress as they go on. Irene, I don't know if you noticed, you do say a lot. It's like every 3 words. Like at first I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna let it go. And then I was like, oh, it keeps happening. I don't think she knows. So, and normally when we talk, we do that, you know what I mean? But on here, it gets amplified because we're intently listening. Because when you're talking to somebody face to face, you're vibing a conversation. Nobody cares how many times you say But the moment you go to public speaking, then everybody starts critiquing and all that stuff. So just something to pay attention to, because I do it a lot too. So when I'm on my podcast, I have to think about not saying it and just pause and then talk again. You see? Yeah. I do it all the time. And the moment you point it out, now you try to look for it, and everybody else is like, I'm not the only one. So let's see here. Okay, so these are the notes overall with some of the ideas. I don't know if you guys started these things already. If you've thought of them already, no worries. If you haven't thought of them, I'm glad I'm bringing it to your attention. So first things first, explain offense. Explain why it happens. So what I mean by that is a theory I always have, and you may have a different way to explain it, but being offended is a self-inflicted emotion. So when you are talking about people getting offended, it's helpful to tell them why they get offended. Because in the course of asking these conversations, and you've given them information like, hey, look, offense is a self-inflicted emotion. It has to do with your set of priorities, right? And why are you holding this idea as a higher priority than how you see yourself? This is why you're getting offended. And when you have the ability to control that, then you have the ability to not be offended by what people say, and then respond appropriately, and we can have a constructive dialogue. And so when you give people that tool, then you help them down the path further into these conversations, because what's going to happen is people aren't going to Google this stuff. There's going to be a set of people, maybe 20 or 25% of your audience that will Google things you say and then try to teach themselves and truly try to learn, but other people won't. And it'll go one ear and out the other. And some of it may be helpful, some of it won't. But if you give them those tools, and since it's going one ear and out the other, you're going to help them more, So think about that as a responsibility. Whenever you say a term that may have controversial definitions or maybe a muddy understanding, just explain it however you see it, in that way. The next one would be break down your ideas in short form in order to create conversation flow. So whenever you bring up, hey, we're going to talk about this, break it down right quick. Just a short breakdown. If I say, hey, we're going to talk about racial injustice, things like bum, 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 and then it creates conversation flow, because something you might say might spark Brian, or you might spark you, Brian, or might spark you, Irene. And then that brings me to a point. I have 2 points down. Interrupt each other slightly. You know, when an idea pops, like, yo, you know, boom, and go into that. You know, I know you guys aren't going to be offended by each other, you know, popping ideas, especially on a podcast, because it helps create the, you know, the conversation to go forward. So don't be afraid to do that. It doesn't have to feel scripted, you know? So yeah, that would be my advice on that. Just dive in. Like if you feel the need to say something, if an idea makes you passionate, talk about it. It doesn't matter if it's episode 1 or episode 85. You know, talk about it. When I did my first podcast episode, I was really passionate about these crazy behind flat earth people. And I did a whole episode about flat earthers on my first episode. It was wild, you know? So that's where the passion led me, and you know, it was unscripted. And then we added in the cool little props and screen tricks later. You know, so just let it take you there. You know, don't feel like, oh, I can't let the cat out the bag. No, because you're trying to grab an audience, and if an audience sees episode 1, y'all are diving right in and be like, ooh, these guys are serious. Let me go ahead and listen in. Like episode 1 was like this. Imagine what the next one's about to be. You know, so just dive in. Okay, so this one struck me. And this one's more like my passion bleeding through because of what I've seen and people not understanding. Explain what Black is. Why is it important? How is it different than white? And like Black people identify with the idea of being Black because we don't have, our history was stolen from us generations ago. So like I can't tell you like, oh, I'm Nigerian or Ghanaian, you know, I'm from Egypt, you know what I mean? My history is Egyptian, right? So we don't have those cultural identifiers, whereas typically white people can tell you, oh yeah, my great grandfather's in Ireland right now. You know, I can go to his grave and visit, and we have a family tradition where we go to London or we go to France or we, you know what I'm saying? And so you have that history. You know, I was talking to a guy, you know, he knows and has paperwork documenting when his last name was changed and why. That's bananas to me. Right? And so, you know, we use white as a general term to just describe people with white skin, but however, Black is a term we use to identify as a culture because Black exists specifically in America and nowhere else in the world. You know, when you see other people of color in other places in the world, they know their history and culture because they didn't have the unique American experience that goes with Black. And so it's different. You know, so when you get into that and you start using that term Black, especially when you're talking about why people get nervous trying to use the term Black, explain what it is. Like, let them know what the difference there is. You can get in trouble on the internet when you're talking about saying some of these things. Mention cancel culture. Like, that could be a whole nother conversation that you guys can go off on, right? Because cancel culture is ridiculous and it's huge. And so that's where that internet vibe is. You know, if you go to Black Twitter is like all 100% cancel culture. So it's hilarious, but that's what it is. We also talked about, generalization. That was mentioned somewhere because I wrote this note, and I know it was, I just don't remember. But like, you said something about like generalizing things, and the note I wrote was this: generalization is profiling. And it's not a bad thing. It's a basic human instinct used to protect ourselves when we don't know everything. So it's kind of like when we were talking about the terms we use to identify people, you know, let's just use white and Black. We use those terms to identify people in groups because that's how our brain works. And we have to break out of the primal instinct that tells us this is how we categorize things quickly in order to protect ourselves and see the safest path to our next goal. And sometimes conversations become very unsafe and hostile. And so we want to know terms that are, that are safe to use with everybody who's like you. Things can get very fishy when talking about that culture because I have zero reference for that. Right? However, what I'm looking for, my base instinct is to go, okay, enough of all the specifics. How do I just identify this and move on? Right? And that's what people do And so the whole point of this podcast is to break people out of their primal instinct and go into a more social interactions and identifying people where we can ask those safe questions. Like, hey, how do you identify? What is that? I just want to make sure I'm using the right term when I'm talking to you. You know what I mean? Boom. You know, so I would explain that, because sometimes when you tell people how their brain works, they soften up and they're able to listen, because you understand that what they're doing isn't bad and what you're saying isn't an attack on them, you know. But overall, I like it. I like the flow, and I think once you guys find your rhythm, it's gonna be off the chain. You know, biggest no, just when you throw out those controversial ideas, break them down. You know, break them down, because then that creates more conversation, creates, you know, more things to talk about. I know in the beginning we had talked about you wanted your thing to be like 30 minutes or whatever. Forget the time. Let that go. Just talk. You know, don't try to end it. Don't try to see, you know, when you got to go, unless you actually have to go somewhere. You know, if you actually have to go somewhere, then that's different. But, you know, if you don't have to go anywhere, don't worry about the time. Just go. You know, if the conversation's fire, it's fire. Let it run. So, any questions, concerns, random emotional outbursts for me? I mess up all the time. You know, Art just edits out a lot of the stuff. Like, Art's the magic behind like our podcast, because you have no idea. Like, if you watch some of the earlier ones, like, Art's a troll. Like, he's a troll at heart. He's a very intelligent troll, but he's a troll. And so he would troll me on the podcast because he knew he was editing and had full control over everything. And when I said something that was wrong, he would break the podcast, put it on the screen, correct me, and then go back to the podcast. I'm like, you're just an ass. And I would have no idea it's happening, because after he edits everything, he just uploads it to YouTube. He's like, oh, go watch it, which is great, because then I get another level of enjoyment out of it, you know, because I'm like, I'm watching it for the first time like everybody else. You know, so don't worry about messing up. It's cool. You know, even if like facts are wrong or whatever, don't worry about it. You know, because then you can always correct yourself in the next one. And that's part of the humanization of the podcast. You're not experts. You're just talking. You're talking from your own experiences, and then you're learning too. You know, a lot of the things that I know and I understand, even the things I've voiced here, are things that I learned while talking on my podcast and talking to other people. And so that's what made me more politically aware, made me more socially aware, because I had people that I had zero experience dealing with sitting right next to me having a conversation. I'm like, okay, now you're in my bubble where I actually care about you. And so I have to respect you. I can't just ignore you and walk past you on the street. So now I got to learn, you know, and that my podcast forced me to do that. And so you'll get there too with some of the other stuff, like the feeling nervous and everything. You're like, nah, I'm here or whatever. It just is what it is. Let's go. So cool. If you like this podcast, go ahead and hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button, and make sure you hit the bell next to the subscribe button so you get the notification when we drop the video. All right. Love y'all.